we call it the Assembly of Investment Chairs. Everyone on your investment committee is welcome to attend.
Good to come. Please let Bailey or Sebastian or I know, or other organisations that you think would benefit from this, which is put on for your benefit. There's no cost to you. The objective is to disseminate information around the issues that investment committees face, and if we can spread the word more widely for people that you know, then please let us know. Thank you. Over to you, Seb.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Craig. And before you disappear, you might not be here in my closing remarks. So I want to thank you. So Craig actually sort of incepted this as a Otago Business School tollmata, an advisor to the Dean. And, this was his brainchild. He brought us and the New Zealand Super Fund together. And year in and year out, you're taking on another hat out of your many hats and supporting this event. So we've got a small gift of appreciation. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you. See you, Craig. Thank you.
So Craig will be back for drinks at the end of the day. So if anyone's keen to chat with him, he's got lots of wise inputs. We'd have to get you to come speak one day, huh? And at the dinner as well, for those of you that have registered. So this next session is actually really, dear to my passions and where I look to do more research, hopefully, and support this community. And I think it's also potentially the part of the investment industry that's potentially, the most synergistic with our target audience here. And that's the impact investing sector, right? Or market, or I'm not sure what to call it yet. It's still growing, right? And it's a really important sector that puts, impact at least beside, if not above, the financial return of investments. And before I steal anyone's thunder, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jamie Newth, a fellow academic, but also entrepreneur. So Jamie, please join us. Thank you.
You need me on the mic, don't you?
That'd be up to you. Yeah, you can walk around.
Okay. Oh, we'll see how we go. We're past the post-lunch slump and we're deep into the mid-afternoon or something else anyway. And I'm sure you're deeply encouraged by the fact that you're being emceed by an academic and your first speaker is another one. But rest assured, I'm going to be the first of 3 stories, I think, to kind of liven up the afternoon. And I'm going to set a timer to keep me to time here. So, kia ora koutou nā rangatira mā, ko Jamie Newth. I'm the founder of, let's forget the academic thing because that's depressing, founder of Soul Capital, long-time agitator for a more impactful investment and enterprise ecosystem, and with quite a bit of skin in the game now. So there's I'm the first of 3 speakers, so myself, Bill, and Stephen, and we thought, I'm going to speak on your behalf for a second here, guys. We thought that we're getting pretty diminishing returns in talking about impact investing in theory with this audience. So we thought we would tell you the stories of how we're doing it. With 3 complementary funds, in the sense that we will do something slightly different, but pretty well aligned in terms of principles. And there's lots of great stories to tell about impact investing and why we should do it and why we should do more of it if we already are. And broadly speaking, and almost at a platitudinal kind of level, we say, well, let's use as iwi, philanthropics, NGOs, whatever owner of assets, let's use all our assets for good. And you should go do that. The story that I'm going to tell is not just doing it in generally doing it for good, but putting investment assets to work specifically for Foundation Newth's kaupapa. So who's Foundation Newth? I think we all know who that is, but what do I mean by that? What are those specific kind of priorities that we're saying we're operationalizing or turning in, giving expression to, giving reality to? Apart from the general community benefit, there's an obvious geographic priority, right? Auckland and Northland, Tamaki Tautoko. Priorities, impact themes, as we call them: environmental regeneration, increased equity of the social power kind, and increased social inclusion. And obviously some priority community groups within there as well. So Māori Pacific are those living rainbow, those living with a disability, and recent migrants, or we particularly focus on former refugees. So those are the priorities that Foundation Newth has that we've taken on board, or that shape our mandate that we are investing for, which sounds like we're trying to thread 2 or 3 needles in a row there, right? But with the right kind of principles, the right relationship between us as GP and Foundation Newth as LP, we're getting it done and proving what's possible. So allow me to repeat myself for another 18 minutes as we get into this. Because I'm going first, I thought, well, I just said, let's not talk about it in theory. I'm going to quickly talk about it in theory, just so that we're kind of on the same page for those that are kind of new to the concept. Essentially what we're saying here, and it's always good to be in the top right-hand corner of a 2x2 matrix, especially if you're from one of these tall towers around here, right? So essentially what we're saying here, we're in this utopian top right-hand quadrant where typically your mainstream investment, including ESG, is somewhere in that left-hand box. Our grant work, our philanthropic work, and that has a financial floor. Our grant making work has a minimum degree of impact, and obviously we don't have a financial floor. Impact investors are in that top right. That's usually as far as the conversation goes, right? But what it doesn't do is kind of give light to the degree of nuance that exists in that box, right? Whether you see this on a spectrum or whatever else, there's a whole bunch of nuance in there. And I don't just mean in terms of, well, I mean a bunch of things there in terms of the types of assets that could sit in there, the risk return profile, the instruments that you use, the work. So a really blunt way to put it is you could start off with 2 kind of categories, and I'm doing that intentionally. Say, well, you can have impact, finance first impact investors, where to Sebastian's earlier point, where the impact is on a par or perhaps slightly secondary to the financial return, and those that put the impact ahead of the commercial return. I guess the moral of that story is the idea of concessionary returns and impact investing is, I want to say it's a myth, it's a choice. It's a strategic or tactical choice. And Foundation Newth has made that choice to be, for Te Pai ki te Rangi, to be an impact first fund. That does not mean that all the deals we do are concessionary, except when it does. And that's an active choice. And there's some really obvious choices that we are making where the financial returns are concessionary to unlock the impact. An obvious one that we're dealing with right now is affordable housing. We're going to decrease the income we generate from a housing asset to pass that discount on to whānau living in those homes. That's a really obvious scenario. But all the deals that I'm going to talk you through, some of our deals, none of them are concessionary in terms of the financial return. Where the concession comes for Te Pai ki te Rangi, and I think for impact first impact investors, is in the transaction costs that we're willing to bear to make these deals happen. Whether that be outsized due diligence, whether that be complicated deal structuring and execution, whether that be outsized portfolio management. These are the things we need to do to unlock the impact for those priority groups and that priority geography across those things. So, just a bit of a repeat. These are the principles that underpin our mandate. And they're just Foundation Newth priorities as applies to an investment fund. So I don't think I need to repeat those for you, except to say that we also have a couple of overarching impact themes. One is to increase provide more equitable access to those priority communities to this type of finance, which means more than just be less prejudiced when you do investing. It means understand why those groups don't have the same opportunities to receive this kind of capital. That's not just because of biases within BCPE. That is because society is unequal at a structural kind of level, which then manifests in terms of lower levels of investability, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to be where the market isn't, or be a bridge to where the market isn't, or where the investees are to where the market is, which may mean generally like I said, increased transaction costs. The bigger one is likely to be taking greater risk in any given deal. The other one is to be catalytic in the ecosystem. And I think my colleagues who are going to follow me will say the same thing, is that in general, when we start doing these deals and you create the platform for the deals to happen, the ecosystem of non-impact investors, they take interest and they start to play with you. And so the deals that I'll talk about, all of them, the 4 deals all have, we may have led them all, but all 4 of them have mainstream investors involved as well, from VC through to a bank. So that's the impact kind of thematics. In terms of our other guardrails that guide our mandate. And I'll come back to some more principles, but essentially with Foundation North wanting to give expression to all those priorities and to prioritize, none of these things are exclusive, by the way, prioritize the geography, prioritize those impact themes, prioritize those priority communities. Sounds like threading 3 needles, right? Particularly where there isn't necessarily the evidence that there's going to be, or the benchmarks in terms of adequate deal flow to deploy this money. So we need to be flexible on everything else. So it's not just an early stage VC fund, it's not just a PE or more broader PE fund. We'll use whatever assets and pretty much any instrument other than in public equities, public debt, to give expression to these priorities, which is highly unusual, really hard to be really good at, but we shall see. But it is prioritizing the impact over the efficiencies of doing one thing and then rinse and repeat. So we've got these guardrails, which gives us flexibility, and then the relationship with Foundation North as an LP to modify these over time as we generate insights as to what the community and what the market needs. So we tailor, so the graph to your right there gives us those are our maximum exposures across 4 categories of risk and return profile. You may think of them and they broadly kind of translate, and the author of these names is also in the room, Tim there, you'll hear from him later, Kakano, Whakatupu, Whakanui, and Whakamarama. You could broadly say that these go seed, growth, expansion, and impact transformation. That's very much a venture kind of terminology. Think of them more as risk and return profile. So what this does is give us the opportunity to do the transformative early stage, probably tech-based startup kind of deals, all the way through to lower risk, lower return housing type deals. And then we're an active fund manager, obviously case by case, but we mitigate those risks like everyone does, but we also maximize impact, not just through the way we screen, diligence, and execute, but also the way we manage the portfolio. So let's talk about some real deals. So this is one of those early stage tech VC deals that we've done. And the person on the right, the actual live human on the screen, is Arash, who has a condition, Meniere's disease, where, long story short, he's now deaf in one ear and is potentially going to lose hearing in the other ear as well. Having done Masters at Melbourne Uni, PhD at Auckland Uni, which is when he had this condition and lost the hearing in that ear, he realised that he'd never studied at the 2 best universities in Australia and New Zealand. He'd never studied with someone who was deaf. So he went on a journey of figuring out what the hell was going on. And you can probably see where this went in terms of going deep into understanding, working with the deaf community to find out why deaf people were absent from his higher education kind of journey. So it was very much an educational kind of motivation for him. And he's an engineer, so he wanted to solve the problem. And he came up with a bunch of terrible ideas had them invalidated by the community until he landed on the idea of scalable sign language avatar technology for systems level accessibility. So long story short, artificial intelligence, hyper real avatar needs to be hyper real because the facial expressions and the nuance of your bodily movements, including your posture, is most of the language, right? So cartoony kind of avatars won't cut it. One of the first things, bad ideas he came up with was, hey, closed captions, subtitles, problem solved, which is what most of us kind of think. But if you're a young child, you can't read. So that's not ideal. And learning to read is really hard, which is the jumping off point for this story. even if you can, no matter what language you can read, it's your second language. Because sign is your first language as a deaf person. So that's one of those interesting ones where you say, well, you can see how this is deeply impactful because all of Netflix, all of YouTube, every kid's book potentially becomes immediately accessible. Yeah, this talk becomes accessible without the need to have a live translator in every context. One of the verticals that they're validating right now is emergency alerts. Because if you're deaf, it's not coming in sign language at the moment, right? So there's examples of people with a shooting in Christchurch, saw people running at them, had no idea what was going on, and no one could tell them. Sign language is used in emergency alerts in the US, but it takes 3 hours to get the translator to the alert place, etc., which is not really ideal for a disaster context. And we're going for time. So, running out of time. So, VC equity deal, very high risk. Sorry, that one's VC equity deal, very high risk. Deep tech. Mate, we led that deal. What that did was help mainstream VC get over the fact that they thought that the market for this was too small because it's just for deaf people. It's just for deaf people, but you can't understand the total addressable market just by the number of people who are deaf, because you need to serve them at every touch point in which they should be served. Yeah, so that's every streaming platform, every device, etc. Whether you think but there's a market opportunity for it, a moral obligation, or a government requirement, because in New Zealand it's one of our national languages, right? So to contrast that, this is a community organisation localised, where we provided a loan. Localised as a social enterprise, and they won the Auckland Council's contract to do the inorganic collection, where we buy cheap vouchers, use them for 3 years and chuck them on the side of the road, and someone else pays for them to go away. So that side of things aside, there's an opportunity here for us to obviously the obvious kind of impact logic for this one is in the environmental side of things. So they do excellent things in terms of collecting that waste and rather than just sending it to landfill, sort it, recycle what can be recycled, but reuse and distribute to community organizations, social enterprises to do good stuff with that so-called waste. One of the things, and we'll talk about impact measurement in a minute, one of the things that was really interesting about digging into the impact that this organization has is it's not just about the waste. It's also about the capability that they will be generating amongst other community organizations to deal with waste more generally. So part of the impact measurement regime we have with them is enabling the uplift of the capability of an ecosystem of actors to deal with this kind of stuff. But there's an obvious one also just keeping it out of landfill. So previous deal, tech VC, mainstream tech VC investors jumped on board once we led around, did the DD. Wrote a small check, they wrote much bigger checks, so it was a win. Another one here is an example of we couldn't do all of this loan, Kiwibank did the rest. Kiwibank couldn't do all of it. So when we say impact investing is hard, Foundation Newth can do it, mainstream VC can do it, in this case one of the banks can do it. I won't talk about these next ones, but that's a plastic bottle that's not made out of plastic, it's made out of plants, soon to be made out of organic waste. And this one's about women and gender diverse people having more greater expression in culture. So therefore seeing themselves, see that they matter. So quite an interesting theory of change and impact model this organization has, narrative news. So I'm going to finish off with a little bit about measurement and some principle stuff. Systems thinking is one of those terms that people stand up in front of a room and misuse in annoying ways all the time. This is lowercase s systems thinking, but it is a principle where when we invest, we are the leaping off point for us understanding the impact of a potential investment is understanding what problem that venture or project or enterprise is purporting to solve. And going deep into that, thinking about what causes it, not just how is this creating some symptoms, but thinking about the systems that cause it and the systems that will enable that impact to be scaled or to be enduring. And a key part of that is not thinking that us as investors or necessarily our founders as founders, that they have all the knowledge, all the insights, and trust them, we're going to go and save this, solve this issue, save this community or whatever else. Right. So we trust the lived experience of people who are directly impacted should be impact on their terms. The best way to solve for everything I've mentioned around priority communities is to make sure that they are the owners and or leaders of the projects that we invest in. Yeah. And if that's not the case, it needs to be a pretty good reason for it. And if it's not the case, then there needs to be some pretty deep validation with that community. So the story about Kara Tech and Arash, who lost his hearing, is an example of, and I'm going to talk about them in terms of impact measurement, as an example of being a member of that community with that lived experience, but going really deep in terms of the design of what that innovation looks like and how it gets scaled. So here's a little bit of insight into our impact measurement process, which is usually something that people are really curious about. So I know Bill Murphy from Purpose Capital is going to talk about some of the international standards that impact investors like Purpose Capital does draw on. But just to give you an example of how we go deep and think kind of systemically, that's intentionally not very visible, by the way. But we go deep into understanding the problem that our ventures are purporting to solve. So this is some of the work that we did with Kara Tech. So if we stayed surface level, you can see an iceberg there, right? If we stayed surface level, we would say, here's the elements of what makes this an investable opportunity. Deaf community, not adequately served. Closed caption, subtitles is not the answer. There's lots of platforms and touch points in which this technology ought to be embedded. Multiply that by whatever number, and the impact would be the number of people who use it. Once you go deep, you understand that actually, on a more systemic level, our whole society is not designed to include these people because it's an invisible disability. And one thing that we realized is that the burden for getting access is entirely on those who are deaf. There's these huge transaction costs, very investor kind of term, but huge transaction costs to go and get the support you need to understand something. And so we go down to that level, right? Translate that through to our theory of change, and then the goals that we set for our portfolio companies, the proportion of those goals that are achieved across the life of the fund determines our carry as investors. So it's in our interest to set these goals to stretch impact goals, but to achieve those, it puts an alignment between our impact first investor and our incentives as a fund manager. So for example, for Kara, we needed to make sure that the goals that we set for that venture are aligned to that deeper understanding around shifting that burden from just being on someone who's deaf, go and solve for it, here's some money, go and figure out how to get it done, through to every expression of Kara's technology actually shifting that burden. You end up with some simple pragmatic kind of measures like the number of contracts they have across different sectors, so we can start getting that reach. We know that these principles are embedded, even though the measure is pragmatic, is because at all times this is validated with the deaf community. So it's embedded into the organization. This stuff, I think I'm out of time. So to wrap up, this stuff can be challenging, can be hard to get it right first time. So Bacon, and this is what we've done with Foundation North. We need to report on the things you'd expect us to report on, but we also need to report on what we're learning. So there's a culture of learning and flexibility between us and our LP. So whether you are doing this via an intermediary, doing it direct, make sure whatever policies, sidepos, or frameworks you put around it are flexible, because we're about achieving change. So to know how that's going to look ahead of time, may not necessarily make sense. But make sure you're responding to what the market actually needs, because we actually need to make that market as well. So I won't go through all this, but there's lots of ways to play. There's lots of things to consider, and there's lots of optionality in this space. It's not as niche as you may think it is. I mentioned that we can tie our performance fees and carries and that kind of thing to the stuff that matters. We're an example of that. Depending on who you are as an investor or as an asset owner, you can think about what position makes sense for you. That may be first loss or concessionary positions and being impact first, but it need not be. In any given deal, you can quite easily, I think, sorry, that's overstatement. It is possible to crowd in other investors or other funding bodies. As soon as we put something up or even an idea, there's always interest. You can sit on boards like in our previous talk and then have strong influence there. We do that for a big chunk of our portfolio and so on and so on. But what Foundation Newth has done in a way which is particularly powerful is to say, we're doing this grant making, which we've done for a long time, we understand really well. Let's bring our investment tools to bear specifically on that kaupapa. And then you can see the logic there of potentially using the full stack of grants, debt, equity, whatever else, and really target in aligned ways. We've got Q&A after this. So please feel free to ask any questions if you're feeling confused or provoked.